Hi guys. Okay, so this is the recording for week 9, which is, as you should already know, Tennessee Williams's Streetcar Named Desire, which was first performed in Broadway in 1947, and which uses the kind of interweaving relations between the three main characters in order to engage with the kind of contradictions and potentially explosive conflicts that were emerging in American society at the time that it was made, especially in the South, in the southern states of the US. Um, Streetcar is set in New Orleans, so in Louisiana, in what would be called kind of the Deep South. Um, it's very hot. It's also a kind of center of jazz and of kind of urban life, excitement, also the kind of place where young working class people might gravitate to in order to find employment, but also in order to kind of catch up on the kind of economic boom which America is experiencing following the Second World War. Okay, so the main characters are Blanche Dubois, a woman in her 30s, and her younger sister Stella and Stella's husband Stanley Kowalski. The play starts as Blanche comes to visit Stella. Um, she has previously spent her life on a kind of old plantation, so on an old slave owning property which her and Stella's family used to own. So yeah, it becomes clear when Blanche arrives that she's an alcoholic and that she's traumatized by the loss of this family home, and also that she's prone to kind of trying to live a romanticized and a fantasy version of life. This is something which is very important for Blanche's character. We're not going to talk about it too much because we're not really focusing on Blanche in isolation for the sake of this class, but again, if you do watch a full production of Streetcar or you do read the whole thing, you'll see the way in which Blanche's continuous desire to live in a fantasy world and to escape from the reality not only of the decline of her family's fortune but also from her own fading youth, the way in which that plays out within the play. And we'll talk about it a bit here, but not all that much. So yeah, Blanche is very invested in upper class mannerisms, kind of gentility, being quite delicate, or at least in the idea of those things. And Stanley, um, the younger, very powerful male figure, is much more masculine, much more aggressive, much more assertive, and treats Stella very badly, as we'll see, even though she claims that she loves him more or less continuously. Yeah, and final point of the summary is that although it seems as if Blanche might find happiness with one of Stanley's friends called Mitch, basically the lies that she's been telling throughout the play about her own past as well as her own mental health begins to unravel. Stanley finds out the truth about her past, how she's lived since the kind of decline of the family home and the family estate, and this includes, it's very heavily suggested that Blanche has been engaging in some kind of sex work in order to support herself, and we also learn that she had a younger husband who killed himself because Blanche discovered him with another man, and she said that she said she found him disgusting, and at that point he committed suicide, and she's kind of haunted by the guilt of this. And yeah, at the end of the play, Stanley assaults Blanche, and the next day, she, having suffered permanent mental damage, is taken away to a mental hospital, while Stanley and Stella Stella is visibly very, very upset, but kind of keeping it together, and Stanley kind of puts his arms around Stella, and the sense is that's it, and Stanley, in some way or another, has won. So we want to look at we have a rough idea of what the characters are. If we want to look at Streetcar, though, it's important to think about the different kinds of time periods that these characters represent, because both Blanche and Stanley are very much products of two different historical moments, even though they're alive at the same time. So, a bit of context, the period of the Second World War was a time of transition and of a major economic boom in the US. The country didn't lose, relatively speaking, didn't lose a lot of its labor force in the war, and it also made a lot of money and developed its industry as a result of arms manufacture. Involvement within the war itself also meant that first and second generation immigrants, like Stanley Kowalski, began to view themselves as being key to the country's success. And again, this was reinforced by these immigrants' role in industry following the war. So Kowalski, Stanley, the main male character, is a second generation Polish immigrant, and he's often read as the epitome of this newly confident and entitled industrial worker. He's a distinguished soldier, and he's insistent that he is 100% American. We can see both of these different points in the play. For example, when Stella and Blanche are talking for the first time, Stella shows Blanche a picture of Stanley here, and she says he was a master sergeant in the engineers corps, and that he's kind of wearing these medals. And Blanche says, he had those on when you met him. And Stella says, I assure you, I wasn't just blinded by all the brass. So Stella says, look, I didn't just fall for Stanley because of his decorations, because he was a good soldier. But it played a role in making Stanley striking and attractive. And it also plays a role in the fact that he feels very much a part of the fabric of American society. And again, we see later on in the play, I'll just get the lead up to it. Blanche calls Stanley a Polak, which is a kind of derogatory term for a Polish immigrant. She says, you healthy Polak without a nerve in your body, of course you don't know what anxiety feels like. And Stanley says, I am not a Polak. People from Poland are Poles, not Polaks. But what I am is 100% American, born and raised in the greatest country on earth, and proud as hell of it. So don't ever call me a Polak. It's important for Stanley's character, Stanley's image of himself. Blanche's character, she's openly xenophobic, she's openly anti-immigrant. And this is a result of the war and a result of the kind of changing economic conditions, which are making people like Stanley much more integrated and much more openly confident than they would have been, especially in the South, even 20 or 30 years before. So yeah, Stanley, unapologetically masculine, and has an undeniable charisma and energy, and he considers himself fully American. He's also cruel, sexist, violent, and almost completely indifferent to the suffering which he causes. He emotionally and physically assaults Blanche throughout the play, and he seems to take a kind of pleasure in this at several points. In the scene that we just looked at, Stanley says that he's going to give Blanche a birthday present and actually gives her a Greyhound ticket, which is a kind of very cheap, well, relatively cheap these days, ticket back to the place where she came from. Just looking for it now. There we go. It's in that envelope. Stanley says, ticket back to Laurel on the Greyhound Tuesday. So he's given Blanche a train ticket home to show that she's not welcome in the house, to show that he doesn't like her. And this kind of pushes Blanche over the edge. She's really upset about it. And Stella says, you didn't need to do that. You needn't have been so cruel to someone alone as she is. So Stanley is cruel, he is uncaring, and he does take things out on Blanche physically and emotionally and psychologically. At the same time, all of these are qualities which one might also associate with a kind of new post-war America. Stanley is forceful, self-interested, and he doesn't care about the kind of traditions and manners that Blanche thinks that she represents and that she's very invested in. So, as we say here, Blanche inhabits an older archetype that of what would be called the Southern Belle. So, belle in the French term, as in beautiful. Louisiana, as I'm sure you guys know, was originally a French colony, and they still speak. There's still a kind of version of French called Cajun French, which is spoken in parts of the South of America, and obviously New Orleans. There's a strong French influence in the history of that state. So, the term referred to a wealthy young white woman from the southern states of the US with refined manners and cultivated taste. As a Southern belle, Blanche is kind of attached to a much earlier period in the history of the South in which a wealthy few maintained an almost aristocratic life as a result of the inherited wealth passed down from the time of slavery. And this is kind of a class that, unlike Stanley, and even unlike a kind of more modern factory-owning class, were slave owners and did not produce goods in the same way. They weren't involved in industry. They didn't have or draw on the kind of reserves of energy that the new working class have and drew on. And I've uploaded to eCampus a bit of an extract from Du Bois's, the great African American historian of the 19th and parts of the 20th century. His book, Black Reconstruction, has a chapter early on in which he gives a kind of description of the class that both Blanche and Stella are from. Just to bear in mind before I read some sections of this, that this class, as I say in the PowerPoint, is, by the time that we see them in Streetcar, they've very much declined, and Blanche is kind of hanging on to the echoes of this class. When Du Bois is writing about them, he's kind of writing about them at the height. But he talks about the planters, who are the kind of plantation owners. And we see that all their ideas of gentility and education went back to the days of European privilege and caste. So they're kind of rooted in this, in these ideas that they've imported in some ways from Europe regarding the proper way to behave, regarding social manners. Du Bois says they cultivated a surface acquaintance with literature and through Latin quotations, even into Congress. Some few had a cultural education at Princeton and at Yale. So Princeton and Yale, major American universities, derive part of their history from this class. And he says to this day, Princeton still don't receive black students. W. Du Bois was a black historian. This book, Black Reconstruction, was written in the 40s, at which time this word would have been much more common in the language. If you're wondering why it's there, I'm not going to say it, but it's not used as a derogatory term when Du Bois is using it. However, he talks about how Southerners, how the kind of planters traveled abroad. The fashionable European world met almost exclusively Americans from the South. So it's this kind of fashionable, trendy, very good at socializing with a certain kind of cultural education, but actually not a very deep one, but just a certain kind of familiarity with the right things to say, with the right kind of quotations to throw into a conversation, to make yourself look educated and make yourself kind of look impressive. And of Southern women affected the latest European styles, were always described as beautiful and must not work for a living except in the organization of their household. So the idea of the Southern belle is someone who speaks a bit of French, knows how to play some music, dressed in kind of the latest European fashions, and whatever they did not work. And yeah, final point, economically, as we said, the planter class had interest in consumption rather than production. So again, Blanche's class, the class she comes from, historically speaking, did not produce large amounts of goods. They owned slaves and they exploited labor in order that they themselves should live more grandly and not mainly for increasing production. So they didn't. Du Bois's point here is also partly that they're not sustainable. The planters don't grow in the way that modern industry grows and expands and keeps becoming stronger. In some ways, they're always a class which once they've reached their height are just declining, and they're kind of consuming the ground from under them. Which is exactly what they've done by the time that we get to Streetcar. So Blanche and Stella grew up on a former plantation called Belle Reve. Sorry, that should be 2 words, but which, as you know, being francophone people, that the name is a not very subtle reference to the fantasies that Blanche continues to try and live out. It's a beautiful dream. It's a beautiful dream which is grounded on slavery, and Tennessee Williams is obviously aware of the kind of contradictions and what it required for the planters to be able to live the kind of lives that they lived, which was a huge amount of violence. But nonetheless, Blanche appears to believe very firmly that the lifestyle that she's inherited and that she wants to keep hold of is beautiful and is worth holding on to. So when Blanche first arrives in New Orleans, it's not clear what has happened to the property, but we know it's been lost. And Stanley is convinced that he has a right to whatever Stella possesses, so he's convinced on finding out what happened to the property because he thinks of it as his. You see this in the scene that I've linked on eCampus from the film, in which Stanley talks about the Napoleonic Code, and he essentially thinks that Blanche has cheated him and Stella, but also him, out of a large inheritance. He doesn't believe that it was just lost. And what we learn is that the plantation faded away over time, or the money associated with the plantation faded away over time. Just to say, if you guys didn't know, slavery is abolished in the US, technically speaking, after the Civil War, so in the middle of the 1860s, which means that Belle Reve has not had slaves working on the plantation for about 80 years by the time that by the time we get to the time of Streetcar. So Blanche herself is not a slave owner, and the family won't have owned slaves for a long time, for about 80 years. But the money that they do have will originally have come from slave owning and from either cotton, probably cotton, but maybe tobacco plantation. But we know that this way of life has been dying out, and we see it in the way that Blanche talks about it, and we can look at that in a sec, actually. So the tension that arises almost immediately between Blanche and Stanley concerns the former's attempts to hold on to manners and lifestyle which have now become hopelessly outmoded, and the latter's attempt to find out what has happened to the property which he believes is rightly his. And in the first scene in which Blanche and Stanley meet, which again is on eCampus, you can see the way that kind of Vivian Lee, who is Blanche, tries to kind of work her manners on Stanley, and you can see the way that Stanley is openly attempting to intimidate Blanche, and Stanley is very suspicious of Blanche's deceit and snobbery, and Blanche is repulsed by Stanley's working class pragmatism, his dislike and impatience with anything kind of cultivated or refined, his Polish heritage, and his treatment of Stella. And again, while we can think of this kind of conflict between the Southern Belle, between the Old South and the New South, as being the central conflict in the play, we have to keep remembering that also this is not a conflict between two classes at their height. This is a conflict between one class that has, in all but name, passed away, no longer exists in any meaningful way, and the class which is ascendant, the class which is on the rise, the industry, the new America. So the play can be read, I would argue, and many other critics have argued. This is not an original reading of the play, by the way. I'm not trying to give you my own wacky ideas. This is fairly accepted. That Streetcar is a story of what happens to an old worldview, such as Blanche's, and the world and the kind of traditions of the plantation class, when it no longer has any economic power. So you kind of have these echoes of these lifestyles and these ideologies. And what you see in Blanche is their kind of final moment before they're wiped clean, so to speak, by the actions of by the cruelty, by the aggressiveness of Stanley, which is uncompromising and which, doesn't concern itself with the kind of traditions in which Blanche is invested, which, as we saw in Du Bois, those traditions themselves have only been around for about 100 years, 150 years before Blanche is born. The whole thing is quite superficial. The whole thing is kind of imported, and it's this kind of, fashionable, potentially vulnerable way of life, which Stanley finally wipes out. So then we have Stella. And as I say, Stella is the kind of middle ground between Blanche and Stanley. She is much more practical and self-aware than her older sister. And yes, several years before the play begins, Stella recognized that the old way of life in the rural South was passing away, seemingly, and she moved to New Orleans, which is a city. It's not the biggest city in the world, but it's certainly a lot bigger than other places in Louisiana, in order to start a life for herself. And we see this in the first conversation between Blanche and Stella in the extract, which is on eCampus as well. And Blanche kind of expresses this degree of resentment towards Stella, and she says, you left, but I stayed. And we can see this if we just skip past the scene where they talk about the bit where they talk about Stanley, and then Blanche says, well, Stella, you're going to reproach me. I know you're bound to reproach me, but before you do, so reproaching her about losing Belle Rev, about what's happened. And she says, before you reproach me, take into consideration you left, I stayed and struggled. You came to New Orleans and looked out for yourself. I stayed at Belle Rev and tried to hold it together. I'm not meaning this in any reproachful way, but all the burden descended on my shoulders. So Blanche sees herself as someone who was kind of left trying to support this way of life, which Stella had chosen not to go into. She went off and tried to start a different life for herself in the city. Blanche became an English teacher as well at a local school, as well as being this kind of descendant of Belle Rev. So she has been working. She has had actually quite a difficult life, regardless of the fact that she presents herself as if she's kind of lived in luxury. And Stella says, the best I could do was make my own living, Blanche. And then we have a important long speech from Blanche where she's obviously very traumatized about the kind of last few years of her life at Belle Rev, and she says, I took the blows in my face and my body, all those deaths, The long parade to the graveyard, father, mother, Margaret, that dreadful way, so big with it, it couldn't be put in a coffin, but had to be burned like rubbish. Don't know what that refers to. Presumably some kind of disease, possibly an inherited venereal disease. Possibly that would fit the general view of decadence and corruption, which Williams suggests that the kind of planter class have died from, essentially. You get a real sense of entropy in this speech. You get a real sense of people dying out one by one, and Blanche is kind of the only one who's left, and she has to organize everything. She hears their deaths. She says to Stella, "You came home for the funerals," but she heard their hoarse breathing, so the kind of way that people breathe when they die, and the rattles. And sometimes they even, they cry out in pain. And then she says, "Death is expensive, Miss Stella." So she's kind of suggesting that she had to spend all of the money either on care for relatives who were dying or on funerals. And they didn't take care of the future. So she says, which of them left us a fortune? Which of them left a cent of insurance even? Oh, poor Jessie, 100 to pay for her coffin. So again, as we kind of saw in Du Bois, this class is decadent. It's not planning for the future. It's not expanding. It's just collapsing. And they didn't leave Blanche, at least she claims they didn't leave her anything which would enable her to look out for herself or for Stella. And I with my pitiful salary at the school. And then she says something really mean. Where were you in bed with your Polak? And Blanche says, "You be still, that's enough." So yeah, we get this very strong sense of resentment on Blanche's part, and we also get an image of the kind of thing that Stella left behind. It's not a positive image. And yeah, but it's also the case that Stella still deeply cares for Blanche, that she is, she lets her stay, she greets them. They greet each other quite excitedly initially when they first see each other again, and then kind of tensions come out. But she does try to look after Blanche. She stands up to Stanley at key points in the play. Again, in the scene about the Napoleonic Code, you see her kind of explaining to Stanley that he just doesn't understand that Blanche's items aren't expensive, that she doesn't have this money that she's kind of hiding away. And Stanley assumes that she's actually much more wealthy than she is. And Stella kind of explains that and tries a lot to kind of justify Blanche's behavior and to be as sympathetic as possible to her sister. And yeah, one of the scenes, again, which is on eCampus, through which to understand Stanley and Stella's relationship, is the scene, it's quite early in the play, in which Stanley's friends attend a poker party. This is a scene in which Blanche meets Mitch, who, as I said at the start, she goes on to have a kind of relationship with, almost marries, but then it all falls apart. And yeah, we don't really have space to talk about that relationship. But again, if you wanted to talk about Mitch, if you wanted to work on Streetcar, if you really like Streetcar, then by all means go ahead. So yeah, Stanley gets more and more frustrated that the women don't leave like they say they're going to, and that Blanche starts to flirt with the men, kind of says annoying, insulting things to them, while at the same time trying to get their attention. And he loses his temper and hits Stella, who retreats upstairs. And we've already seen suggestions that Stanley is abusive in the line, but of course there were things to adjust myself to later on. So, depending on how you want to say this line, if you're an actress, you could just be talking about the fact that when you marry someone, you have to live with them, and that's a process of adjustment. Or you could suggest that Stella, when she married Stanley, discovered a side of his personality that she hadn't seen before, and that side is violent and abusive. So yeah, if that's a decision that you may want to make, or you may want to think about how to perform that line if you were going to work on Streetcar. So for your oral or for your written assessment. But in any case, there is a suggestion that Stanley has done this before. At least we don't know how many times he's done it before, but he's certainly, almost definitely, done it at least once before. And yeah, after Stanley has assaulted Stella, Blanche retreats with Stella upstairs, and Blanche is obviously appalled. She's very worried about her sister, and she already doesn't like Stanley, and now she pretty much hates him, understandably. And we see kind of Stanley. Again, I've put this on eCampus. It's one of the most famous scenes in the film version. Brando in his vest in the rain. And Stanley reverts to an almost childlike anguish and goes outside and kind of calls for Stella. And to Blanche's despair, she goes down and meets him. If you're going to think about this relationship, you want to think about why, I think, which is the kind of questions that we'll end on. Why does Stella go back? And again, if you want to think about the ways in which you might perform this scene or perform this extract from the play, look at the way in which the actress playing Stella looks at Stanley as he's kind of out there screaming for her. Stanley's clearly anguished in some way, but he doesn't apologize. He doesn't try to say that he's sorry. He just kind of he just screams. And she walks down towards him with what I think is quite a strong look of hatred, but nonetheless is going back to him anyway. And the two do kind of share this moment where they embrace, and it is almost tender. How we want to read that is definitely up to us as readers, as audience members, and as potential directors. But yeah, it's not the first time. It's almost definitely not the first time that Stanley's done this, and Stella can't reasonably believe that it'll be the last time. But she goes back to him anyway. So the question is why, which we'll end on. If we want to think about Stanley and Stella's relationship now. So she does insist several times that she loves her husband, and in the scene after the poker game, so in the following morning, she says that she still loves him, and Blanche kind of says it's just desire, it's just lust, and Stella says, kind of A, what's the difference, and B, it is real. And Stanley says, from his perspective, and it's important to foreground the fact that this is from his perspective, he kind of suggests that they have had a kind of vitality and a chemistry between them, which Stella had never experienced before. And we see this in the scene that we looked at just before, in which Stanley says that he's not a Polak. Later on in that scene, when Blanche is in the bath because Stanley has been so cruel to her, Stanley says to Stella, when we first met, me and you thought I was common. How right you was, baby. I was common as dirt. You showed me the snapshot of the place with the columns, that's Belle Rev. I pulled you down off them columns, and how you loved it, having them coloured lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay till she showed here? And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay? Hoity-toity, describing me as an ape. So in Stanley's mind, he was able to show Stella something that she'd never seen before. a kind of energy, a kind of sexual, like unapologetically sexual chemistry. And she loved him, and she loved it, and she loved their relationship. And it's only Blanche which has kind of gotten in the way. Again, this is Stanley's view, and we see at several points in the play that he's not someone who really cares for refined things, and that he, at one point when he first enters, Tennessee Williams describes him as someone who imagines crude images whenever he meets women for the first time. So he is openly very sexualized, and it's not unlikely that he would see this in his relationship with Stella, but also maybe there's a grain of truth in it. However, also we need to consider that Stella is pregnant and married. Stanley may represent a degree of freedom in comparison to the decaying phantoms of Belle Reve, but Stella is by no means a free agent. Now that the family home is gone, Stella knows that she has nowhere else to go if she were to leave Stanley. So yes, Stella is, relatively speaking, more independent than Blanche. She's taken a decision to move into the kind of future and to kind of move with the changes which American society is going through as best as she can do. But that doesn't make her free of the kind of necessities that all women would have been subject to at the time that that Streetcar was performed, which largely means that she needed a husband and a house, especially with a child on the way, in order to provide any kind of security for herself, and she obviously knows this. So again, while Stella might have been able to survive for a time with the support of friends, and she does have friends in New Orleans, we see this throughout, Blanche, her own sister, it serves as a warning in terms of what might happen to an unmarried woman when they reach a certain age and they're not able to support themselves. And so just to finish, Stella is confronted with the same kind of historical developments as her sister. She's not able to hold on to a former class identity. The family that she's from, their traditions, most importantly, their money, their money doesn't exist anymore, and their traditions don't make sense in the modern world. And while Blanche is trying to cling to a past which, is irrelevant now, Stella seems to sense that her best chance of her life will come with Stanley. And it's almost, I think one way of reading her position is that it's as if she's made a decision, and regardless of how difficult it may be, and regardless of how she may come to hate Stanley because of who he is, and especially what he does to her and to her sister, she feels as if she needs to stick by that decision. She's kind of tied herself to the forces that Stanley represents, and she can't go back from that now. It's an open question as to how much one can describe Stella's kind of pursuit of the life that she's chosen as a choice or as a meaningful choice, but I'll leave that up to you guys. So task for this week, obviously look at the clips and the extracts that I've uploaded. As I said in the introduction video, if you want to write about the play, then I would recommend getting hold of the 1951 version. It's a very seminal piece of cinema. Brando's performance is legendary. Vivian Lee's is also very good. It's a good production of Streetcar. There are other productions that you can find online if you look around, but the 1951 film is the seminal production. It was also Brando and the actress who plays Stella were both in the original theatrical run of the film as well. So they had been doing the play on Broadway when it first opened, before the film was shot a few years afterwards. One exercise: write down 5 words to describe the relationship between Stanley and Stella, the relationship between Stella and Blanche, and the relationship between Blanche and Stanley. You could write about any one of those 3 relationships, and I think they're all quite distinct within the play, and they all say something slightly different, or they all have different things that one can say about them. And yeah, just a few questions that we can talk about in terms of the details of the play, but also in terms of its broader meaning. So one simple question at the start of the play, Blanche is described as having rhinestone jewelry, which is a kind of cheap fake diamond. What is the significance of this for her character as a whole? There is a lot of symbolism in Streetcar, most of which isn't very subtle. So I'm sure that you guys will be able to, if you want to pursue the play, if you want to write about the play, you could think about how you would bring this out in a theatrical production of it. And 2, why does Stanley take an immediately hostile attitude towards Blanche? 3, why does Stella stay with Stanley in spite of the way that he treats her? I've given you some possible suggestions as to why she might, but you can make up your own mind too. And 4, final question, who is the most important couple in Streetcar Named Desire? Is it Stanley and Stella, Stella and Blanche, or Blanche and Stanley? Depends on how you want to read the play, and it depends on what you think the play is about and how you respond to it personally. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that next time we have a catch-up session. So, okay guys, that's it. I hope that you have a good week. I hope that you enjoy Streetcar. We'll be doing Baraka's Dutchman next week, which is less well known, but also very interesting. So yeah, take it easy and email me if you have any questions, and I will speak to you next week. Okay, bye.